Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. I'm going to talk to you today about the Conservative Party of BC leadership race, my take on things so far. There's been 3 debates. There's been a lot of stuff on the campaign trail. So I'm going to talk about that. But first, where am I coming from? I'm standing in front of the old BC Penitentiary, one of the few remaining buildings that still stand here. So why am I here in New Westminster at the BC Pen? Well, it so happens that the first warden of this prison in the 1800s was named Arthur McBride. Arthur McBride's son, Richard McBride, became the first Conservative Premier of British Columbia in 1903, and he presided until 1915, the second longest running Premier in the history of BC. So, during that time, McBride presided over an enormous economic expansion of the province, over more than doubling of the population. And a lot of the themes that Sir Richard McBride was championed and well known for was his infrastructure spending, building mines, building roads, railroads. Now, the modern corollary would be pipelines, LNG infrastructure, but the commonality of mines is very much real today. So, there's another aspect to Sir Richard McBride's life that also mirrors what's going on in the current 2026 conservative environment, and that is cancel culture. Not necessarily that the candidates are engaging in cancel culture, but the party its modern incarnation was almost formed in the cauldron of cancel culture. It was John Rustad booted out of the BC Liberal Party for a tweet about the climate supposed crisis. He retweeted Dr. Patrick Moore of Greenpeace, who was now famously been smeared as a climate denier. So anyone who's pushing back on the climate narrative and all the climate emergency and that rhetoric, he was kicked out. So then, ironically, he himself was forced out. And then he, in turn, forced out Dallas Brodie. So it's led to this kind of back and forth of cancel culture, and Sir Richard McBride himself was canceled. His name was removed from Sir Richard McBride Elementary School, which is just up the hill here. They had to rebuild the school because for seismic reasons, but the new building was given an indigenous name, Scowench, which means sea otter. But in the process, all of the woke school trustees and parents, there was a great big deal made in the local media about what a horrible person Sir Richard McBride was. So fast forward to today, David Eby's out there smearing conservatives as white supremacists. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So, that cancel culture, let's talk about some other perspectives and issues related to the leadership races so far. So, and these are, I'm not here to endorse any particular candidate or not endorse another. I'm just giving some possibly critical review of the performance of all of them. Now, one of the issues that has dominated all of the debates, and the number one issue in the debate, and is claimed to be the number one issue in the province, is this: the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has now been instantiated in law in the province of BC. So, here's the problem as I see it. All of the candidates are saying, yes, let's repeal DRIPA. But they're not entirely clear as to why DRIPA needs to be repealed or why it got put in place in the first place. It was, after all, unanimously voted in 2019. Why the big change? Well, here's the problem. None of the candidates, the 5 candidates remaining, have addressed the elephant in the room, as it were, which is the matter of the graves at Kamloops. Now, just a little background. Because I hail from the mining industry, I started doing a deep dive on UNDRIP about 10 years ago. A lot of talk about UNDRIP in the federal context, provincial context, so I decided to read it. And after finishing reading it, I was very pleased because it was evident to me that British Columbia, this jurisdiction that I grew up in and practiced the mining industry in, was like the cream of the crop, the shining example of applying all of the principles of UNDRIP. You know, this concept of free, prior, and informed consent. The mining industry has been doing that for 30 years. I've been out on the land, I've been in band councils, I've negotiated agreements, and the mining industry is very much in favor, and all the extractive industries for that matter, want Indigenous communities to prosper from the resource bounty of this province. So what changed? Why is DRIPA suddenly this impediment, this barrier that we can't smash through? Well, it's because of what happened in coming up to 5 years ago in Kamloops, a press conference where they announced a mass grave containing 215 bodies of slain Indigenous children. This sent shockwaves around the world, and it is still reverberating. So the problem is that the context in which DRIPA is now being applied or looked at or understood, or people are wrapping their heads around it, is in the context, in the background of a supposed mass murder. Now, what has happened since 2021, there's been a number of First Nations come forward, like Williams Lake, with what are evidently what I would describe as bad faith disclosures. There were disclosures of graves where there was never any intention to prove that such graves were real. They relied solely on GPR anomalies, and to this date, they continue to backpedal. So, I hate to say it, but it has now become quite plain that there's no intention to prove the initial allegation. And to my way of thinking, the whole concept of UNDRIP assumes good faith on both sides. So let's talk about free, prior, and informed. Well, to me, what free means is not coerced. You can't force someone to sign on the dotted line and say, oh, well, you provided your consent. Well, no one's doing that here. The consent that has been provided in the past and ongoing is free. It's not coerced. There's no extortion. Informed. Well, that's what we've been doing. The mining industry, I've been engaging. Everyone does this. This engagement best practices have come a long way. The government has a duty to consult, and they've been doing that. So, check mark there. The information they're being informed. And obviously, the word prior, it's almost a no-brainer. If someone is camping in your backyard, and you say, hey, what are you doing? You can't camp in my backyard. It says, well, can you give me your consent now? Well, no. It stands to reason. It's almost, it is a very good faith type of relationship that is supposed to be contemplated here. And that has been going on. So, what has happened because of the Graves narrative, because this allegation of genocide, the government and Canadians in general have been smeared with a general bad faith context. These are the bad faith actors, the government. The Indigenous people are acting entirely in good faith. That's not what's happening. There is bad faith occurring on the Indigenous side. And I'll give you another example. Aside from the Kamloops and this mass grave blood libel, effectively, there's something else that I think is quite sinister that's happening. And that is that people who are representing themselves to be leaders of Indigenous people or speaking on behalf of Indigenous people are not speaking on behalf of Indigenous people at all. They're speaking in concert and in collaboration with activist organizations whose ultimate objective is to bottle up all the resources and keep them in the ground. When UNDRIP was signed in 2019, what was going on? We had Coastal GasLink. You know, we had the Wet'suwet'en chiefs out there opposing the pipeline. Well, it's evident that that group was simply a self-appointed group of representatives that did not represent the interests of the band members. This is well documented. The overwhelming majority of the band members had signed deals and agreements which were very favorable to them. Everyone was happy and on board and was super excited. Let's do this thing. But the media followed these guys around and they were shutting things down. They were trespassing. There was all this there, and then it just kept escalating. We're shutting down railroads. We're shutting down intersections. And in early 2019, before COVID hit, it started slowly trickled out that the people who were shutting down the intersections were white people from the United States. The organizational structure behind these protests were not Indigenous people. It was radical environmental activists, people who had glommed onto and so this is something that the leaders are not addressing in their remarks at all. And I think it's like they're not seeing the forest for the trees. UNDRIP is just one tree in a forest of bad stuff that's happening. Not only do you have UNDRIP, you have the environmental activists that are allies of certain factions within the Indigenous community, exploiting them for their own purposes. Here's a good example of that. Angeli Appadurai. Does anyone remember that name? David Eby became premier by basically snuffing out her leadership campaign when John Horgan stepped down. And why was she such a threat? She was a threat because the Dogwood Initiative, this environmental activist organization, was signing up NDP members right and left. And then it was clear that he could be outvoted. Oh no. So, came this close to being an environmental activist instead of David Eby, who is an environmental activist himself. So, what is the Dogwood Initiative? If you just go on their website, you can see that they are not for responsible development of our natural resources. They are against the development of all natural resources. They want to keep the gas in the ground. They do all these stunts. They're not in favor of LNG extraction. There's no path for them towards a responsible project. They don't want any projects. They just want to kill the projects. And they're using Indigenous people. So this is the problem. Politics on band councils, politics in the various Indigenous organizations that are supposedly speaking in favor. And then at the debate last night, Vaughn Palmer asked, well, what about all the pushback? What if there's a protest? What if they all talked about, well, what happens if there's 5,000 people on the front lawns and there's things being shut down and all this protest? Not one of them said, Or ask the question, well, who's doing the protesting? Is it the Dogwood Initiative? Is it Sierra Club? Is it West Coast Environmental Law? Is it any number of dozens of heavily funded activist organizations? Or is it Indigenous people who just want to go to work and get paid and pay their bills? Who's speaking for who here? And this gets to the nub of the problem. And why it is so awkward, really, that the party has pushed Alice Brodie out, because she's speaking very candidly and plainly to all of these issues. So, now, to the matter of cancel culture, I just want to add this one point. In the second debate, Yuri Fulmer was going after Caroline Elliott over a remark she made about Laurie Throness, who, cancel culture again, kicked out of the BC Liberal Party. So she apparently used the word abhorrent to describe his views. And the furor at the time was related to remarks that Laurie Throness made in a Zoom call when he was back in the 2020 election campaign. So, what did he say? Well, the issue was the distribution of free birth control in high schools. So this issue came up, and he wasn't for it. He has a very conservative, devout Christian worldview. However, he said something that seemed to cause a bomb to go off in newsrooms across the province. He said that the provision of free birth control in schools had a whiff of the old eugenics. Now, people thought that was abhorrent. How dare you say that? Here's the thing. It's true. He was right. It does have a whiff of the old eugenics. Now, I wrote an op-ed about this matter that I never published, and I'll just share with you some things that I wrote at that time, because I knew that Laurie Throness was correct. So how do I know he is right? Back when birth control was being evangelized across Canada, it was directly because of eugenics. So there's a book that was written called by University of Victoria historian Angus McLaren, called in 1990, called Our Own Master Race, Eugenics in Canada, 1885 to 1945. So he says that eugenicists, or the paper, in my paper I say, eugenicists almost single-handedly invented sex education in Canada, including teaching on birth control as an intentional strategy to restrict, quote, defectives from having babies. So furthermore, I'll just read further here. So I can't say anything better than Professor McLaren said it. He wrote this in his book. Like moths to a flame, eugenicists were inexorably drawn to the issue of sexuality, the reproduction of the degenerate, the irrational breeding of the simple-minded, the swamping of Canada by prolific aliens were all subjected to hereditarians, to morbid analysis. Here's the thing. The eugenicists, which included NDP founders J.S. Wordsworth and Tommy Douglas, were concerned that the poor, the lower classes, were breeding, and that the upper classes were restricting their birth rate. So, you don't believe that? Well, here's a quote from Tommy Douglas, supposedly the greatest Canadian, from a 1934 article called Youth and the New Day. So he writes, and I quote from Tommy Douglas, "For generations, there has been no supervision of the eugenics of the race. The result has been that those least fitted to propagate have done so and have filled our jails and mental hospitals at an alarming rate, while the so-called intelligentsia have been steadily reducing their birth rate. So here's the thing. Laurie Throness was absolutely correct. So here's the moral of the story. Rather than get things right from a historical perspective and really understand the truth of things, the right-leaning politicians of BC have been more inclined to take the knee-jerk response. Get rid of them. Let it blow over in the news cycle. You know, good riddance. Well, how's that working out? It's not working out very well. So this is a problem for the Conservatives to work out. You know, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, her name was removed from a school because she was a eugenicist. It's well known that Planned Parenthood and eugenics were birthed from the same process. Now, people will say, well, today's birth control freebies are not related to eugenics. That's not fair to make that comparison. Well, is it? Why is it that the poor, see, the only people who need free birth control are the people who cannot afford birth control. So it's a targeting of those who are less financially well off. Now they're saying, well, it's because of equity and because of the more of a feminist slant on it, that, well, we don't want young women being burdened with the duty of childbirth at too young an age. And there's different rationales being put out there for birth control. But Laurie Throness was right. If you look at the history of state-sponsored and evangelized birth control, it has a whiff of eugenics to it, because to a certain extent, it does reduce the breeding of certain people, the reproduction of certain people. So those are my comments. Will the candidates be more on the nose about Kamloops, about the mass grave conspiracy, if you will? Will they address that head on? Peter Millibar was asked directly by Juno News in a news scrum if he believed there was 215 graves there. He kind of skirted the question. He says, well, there's 215 anomalies, he says, and they're hoping that there's none. But he did kind of confirm that there's 215 anomalies, and even that has been, the Kamloops have backed off of that assertion anyway. So those are my comments. If you like our journalism, please subscribe to our newsletter. Go to newstimes.com, and if you'd like to support our work, you can do so on our website. There's a little button up in the right-hand corner that says support our work. If you would feel so inclined, we would really appreciate it. There's more and more reporting that we would like to do and want to do, but we need more resources to do it. So you can play a part in helping us bring the message. And I thank you for watching.